And here we go for our final part in this lesson 5, if I'm not mistaken, self and emotion. Let's talk a little bit about emotion action tendencies. And a lot of us emotion researchers we really gravitate towards this idea. It resonates that emotions are for doing, and emotions have this tremendous motivational quality. In fact, in teaching psychology of emotion and teaching psychology of motivation, the more I teach those two courses, the more I find the line between emotion and motivation getting fuzzier and fuzzier. Emotions are for doing, and they have tremendous motivational properties. So, for example, fear and disgust both lead to avoidance. So that is, if I'm afraid or I'm disgusted, all else being equal, I'm going to try to avoid that stimulus. And we see then that fear leads to risk avoidance. And Davos, Mackey, and Smith have demonstrated this through several experimental paradigms. One is often they'll prime people with fear or anger and then give them a gambling task and watch how they perform in the gambling task. And we see that people who've been primed with fear in a separate experiment then become more risk averse. So they stop gambling more quickly when they're losing. Anger and happiness lead to approach, and to me, this is one of the reasons that people who talk about positive and negative emotions, I take that as a secondary explanation to emotions, right? Because anger is thought to be a negative, happiness thought to be a positive, but they both lead to approach. That is, if I'm angry, I want to go punch that person, and if I'm happy, I want to go hug them, right? So in terms of motivation, both these positive and negative emotions lead us, impel us to move forward. Yeah. But anger only leads to approach based on one's appraisal of successful action. So I may not approach if I'm angry. I may not approach the boss with my anger if I feel that I might get fired, right? So if there's risk to my anger display, and this is people who can think through it. My neighbor has no anger management whatsoever. He gets angry and then he's just ready to kick everybody's ass, which is a huge joke around the neighborhood. And he is engaged in court-mandated anger management training because he's got to get a grip on this. He's got no emotional intelligence whatsoever, is another way to put this. Anger also leads to risk-taking. So if I anger people and then put them in the gambling paradigm, they will lose their money because they just continue to bet poorly. But both approach and avoidance are subject to cultural norms, especially gender roles. And occasionally I'll cite myself. This was one of the results in my dissertation research, that women in my dissertation, the women felt more comfortable backing up from a fearful stimulus, where interestingly men felt more comfortable when they were in the condition that they could approach the fear stimulus. It was totally flipped around based on sex. And Marilyn and I looked at that a good long time, and unfortunately it was not part of the hypothesis, so it was necessary to replicate the experiment with that as a hypothesis, and in the replication it didn't replicate. But then I changed the experimental paradigm, so who knows what the problem was there. And it didn't matter because at that time it was time for me to leave the auspices of the graduate school and graduate, right? You can't stay in graduate school forever, although some of us maybe wanted to. That's a mixed bag. But culture has a profound hand. Culture is a hidden hand that operates on us. And let me ask you this for the guys. How many guys were told that you have to face your fears? And even as little boys, we're told to face our fears, to deny our emotional state. So is that maybe altering our relationship with fear in a way that's different than females? On average, right? And remember, I'm a social psychologist, so I say on average. You can find 1 million individual examples that will refute that. Now, display rules. Well, people often moderate their emotion expression to conform to display rules. That maybe anger isn't acceptable, or disgust isn't, or contempt isn't acceptable. So you're sitting there in a meeting, and this person has said the same stupid shit in the last 3 meetings, and you want to get this look of contempt on your face, but you notice that people are watching you, especially your boss, and you don't want to demonstrate contempt. So the display rules dictate that you hide your emotion, right? And so you don't display it on your face. And display rules are specifically, they're typically gendered. So males are allowed to express some emotions, and women are not, is usually the most common way that it goes down. And we learn this from our culture, from our parents, etc. It's just a legacy of our upbringing. So gender differences abound, and status differences. Remember, a boss can demonstrate their anger, but an underling might not be able to. For the same circumstance. Okay. So status differences, high status individuals have greater opportunity to display powerful, strong emotions. Low status individuals, right, are highly constrained to display acceptable, allowable emotions. That is, certain emotions are okay that they can display because it's consistent with their position, but not others. Right? If you're a server, and I know many of you have worked as servers, it's probably not okay to display anger or disgust at your customers, right? Because there's a status differential, and you're there to serve them, and no one cares how you feel. And I know that's harsh, but that's kind of the reality of the situation, right? And display of weak emotions can cause one to lose status, and this is a challenge for women in the workplace. Right? Because it's like they're damned if they do, damned if they don't. If they display anger, what do we label them? A bitch, right? If they display weakness or contrition, then they're, talked about as being weak, or sadness as being overly emotional. So women are expected to be the emotional sex, but if they display emotion, then it's evidence that they're not up to the task, that they're too emotional. So we can see how these culturally derived display rules can really unlevel the playing field. In some culture, improper display of emotions can lead to a loss of face, and that is identity and the respect. And loss of face requires ritualistic behaviors to restore face, and Irving Goffman has a book, Interaction Ritual, that explains this quite readily. So, emotion action tendencies then, like I said, capping it off. Emotions are for doing. Emotions can inspire approach, happiness and anger, avoidance, fear and disgust, for example, freezing, sadness, among others, right? So, sadness leads to slowing or freezing, and often we kind of explain that that's to give people time to think, why am I sad? What's wrong? That sadness is a warning that something's wrong in the environment. So, I think it's about time to wind up. I do want to say one more thing about fear. I don't want to say anything about fear, but I'm going to ask you, what did Deming say about fear? And what we've said about fear, think about it. Remember, Deming said, point number 8, drive out fear. A couple things we know about fear. People become risk averse when they're afraid. And one of the things about creativity is always risky. Because when we're creative, we don't know how it's going to turn out, because it's never been done that way before, because it's creative. Creativity generates more failures than it does successes. So if we have a culture of fear in our organization, people are less likely to be creative because they're afraid of failing. So we have to drive fear out of the organization, or we really don't move the organization forward. The organization continues to stick with the tried and true, the safe route, the safe path. And innovation and entrepreneurship don't really exist under those conditions. So Deming, and gosh darn him, yeah, he was a hell of a statistician, but he was every bit as much a psychologist. And my appreciation for Deming grows every year. So what did he say about fear? Drive out fear. And I hope I've given you a lot of reasons as a leader and as a manager in your organization to drive out fear. Because people's self-esteem, their self-efficacy, their relationship with their world, and the relationship with creativity all rely on the absence of fear. So, I hope you all have a good day, and let's sunflower it the hell out of here. Bye.